It starts in the most ordinary American place possible: a gas station, a delivery route, a grocery checkout line, a family looking at a receipt and feeling that strange moment of pressure again. Nothing in that moment looks like the Persian Gulf. Nothing looks like a tanker route near Iran. Nothing looks like the Strait of Hormuz. And that is exactly why this story matters. Because if the Strait of Hormuz stays disrupted, the first thing America feels is not some dramatic geopolitical headline. It is a slower and more dangerous shift. Fuel gets more expensive. Freight gets heavier. Businesses start repricing risk. And the cost of moving almost everything begins to rise. Most people hear Hormuz and assume this is mainly a problem for oil importing countries far from the United States. But that misses the real mechanism. America does not have to import every barrel from the Gulf to feel the shock. It lives inside a global pricing system. And when one of the world's biggest energy choke points stays under pressure, the effect moves through crude, diesel, shipping, aviation, inflation expectations, and eventually household behavior. So, this is the real question. If Hormuz stays disrupted, what actually happens to America? Not in theory, not on a military map, but in gas prices, freight bills, store shelves, business margins, and everyday budgets. The Strait of Hormuz is not just another shipping lane. It is one of the most important energy choke points in the world. That means even a partial disruption matters. You do not need a total and permanent closure to create problems. A sustained period of delays, selective passage, insurance spikes, rerouting, military risk, and reduced tanker confidence is enough to push global energy markets into a more expensive state. And once global energy markets reprice, America feels it. Not because the U.S. is the fragile energy importer it once was. America produces a lot more energy than it did decades ago. But oil is still globally priced. Diesel still matters to trucks, farms, rail, construction, and local delivery. Jet fuel still matters to air travel and logistics. And if the rest of the world suddenly competes harder for replacement supply, the United States does not sit outside that auction. It gets pulled deeper into it. So the real danger is not just, will America run out? The real danger is, what gets repriced when global energy security stops feeling stable? If Hormuz stays disrupted, the first thing that changes is not the local gas station sign. It is the global benchmark. Crude markets begin pricing in risk. Shipping markets begin pricing in danger. Insurance markets begin pricing in uncertainty. And energy buyers begin pricing in the possibility that replacement supply will be more expensive, slower, or both. Then comes the second layer. Refiners, fuel distributors, cargo operators, airlines, manufacturers, and freight-heavy businesses do not wait for every physical shortage to fully appear before reacting. They start adjusting around expected cost pressure. That means contracts change, hedging behavior changes, ordering behavior changes, and in many cases, the economy starts responding before the average household fully understands why. This is why energy shocks are so dangerous politically and economically. They do not stay inside the energy box. A persistent disruption at Hormuz can push up gasoline and diesel. But diesel is where the broader economic signal becomes especially important. Diesel moves freight. Freight moves goods. And once freight gets more expensive, the shock starts leaking into food distribution, retail logistics, local services, construction inputs, and small business operating costs. At the same time, LNG disruption matters globally even if the U.S. household does not think about LNG every day. If global gas markets tighten, allies and trading partners scramble for replacement cargoes that can redirect flows, tighten supply balances, and increase competition for energy in ways that still affect U.S. pricing and export incentives. So what is actually happening is not just oil went up. It is that one disruption begins changing the cost structure of movement itself. And in an economy as large and logistics dependent as America's, that is never a small problem. Here is the chain. Hormuz disruption becomes global energy risk. Global energy risk becomes higher crude and fuel costs. Higher fuel costs become higher transport and operating costs. Higher operating costs become wider price pressure. Wider price pressure becomes renewed inflation anxiety. And renewed inflation anxiety becomes a problem for growth, rate cut hopes, and consumer confidence. Start with oil. Even though most Hormuz crude flows head to Asia, especially China, India, Japan, and South Korea, that does not isolate America from the shock. It does the opposite. If Asian buyers must compete harder for available barrels, or if rerouting and supply substitution intensify, the entire global pricing system adjusts. America is still in that system. Now move to fuels. Gasoline matters emotionally because households see it immediately. But diesel matters structurally because businesses feel it everywhere. A rise in diesel costs hits trucking fleets, local distributors, agricultural transport, warehouse networks, construction equipment, and the whole chain that keeps goods moving through the country. That is how an overseas choke point becomes a domestic cost problem. Then comes freight. If moving goods costs more, somebody absorbs it. Sometimes the seller absorbs it through lower margins. Sometimes the buyer absorbs it through higher prices. Usually the pain is shared. But either way, the system gets tighter. Companies with weak margins get more cautious. They slow hiring. They cut smaller expansion plans. They delay equipment purchases. They become more defensive. And that matters because inflation pressure is not only about what consumers pay. It is also about how businesses behave when costs become harder to predict. Then comes the inflation layer. A new energy shock does not have to recreate the worst of the last inflation cycle to still be damaging. Sometimes the bigger problem is not the absolute price spike. It is the destruction of confidence that disinflation was safely underway. Because once households and businesses start thinking, "Here we go again," their behavior changes. Consumers become more cautious. Businesses become more defensive. Investors become less eager to commit capital. And uncertainty itself starts becoming part of the economic drag. Then comes rates. The Fed may not want to overreact to a geopolitical supply shock. But if energy pressure starts feeding broader inflation psychology, the room for easier policy becomes narrower. That matters for mortgage hopes, auto loans, credit cards, business borrowing, and the broader sense that financial relief might be coming. In other words, a Hormuz disruption does not need to break the U.S. economy overnight. It only has to make everything less comfortable at the same time. Fuel, freight, inflation expectations, margins, and rate cut timing. That is how the damage compounds. For regular Americans, the first visible sign is simple. The weekly gas bill hurts again. That hits commuters first, then delivery workers, then rideshare drivers, then contractors, then families who were already running a tight monthly budget before any new global shock showed up. But the deeper problem is that the damage does not stay at the pump. If diesel stays elevated, the cost of moving food rises. The cost of moving household goods rises. The cost of local distribution rises. Small businesses that rely on regular shipments, service vehicles, or tight operating margins start feeling squeezed. Then travel gets harder. Airlines face fuel pressure. Shipping heavy vacations feel less realistic. Business travel becomes more expensive. And all of that lands in an economy where many households already feel stretched by insurance, rent, debt payments, and everyday essentials. The next layer is psychological. When Americans feel that basic mobility is becoming expensive again, they do not only think about this week's fill-up. They start thinking about what else could move next. Groceries, delivery, school costs, utility bills, summer travel, holiday spending. That shift in mood matters. Because when households get defensive, discretionary spending weakens. And when discretionary spending weakens, parts of the economy that looked stable can soften faster than expected. So for ordinary Americans, the real effect is not just higher prices. It is a renewed feeling that the system is becoming expensive in multiple directions at once. Now, there is an obvious counterargument. America is a major energy producer. So why should a Middle East choke point hit the United States that hard? That argument contains some truth. The U.S. is more resilient than it was in earlier decades. Domestic production gives America more cushioning than many other economies have. And not every disruption automatically becomes a full domestic crisis. But the common misread is thinking that domestic production means domestic isolation. That is not how global energy pricing works. Oil prices are still set in a world market. Refined products can be redirected. Export incentives can rise when foreign markets are stressed. And when buyers around the world scramble to replace disrupted supply, the U.S. can become part of the solution for others, while also importing more price pressure at home. So the correct view is not, America is helpless, and it is not, America is immune. The correct view is, America is more resilient than many countries, but still highly exposed to a global repricing of energy, freight, and inflation risk. And that is enough to matter a lot. So what happens next if Hormuz stays disrupted? There are really three scenarios. The first is the contained scenario. Disruption continues, but not in a way that fully locks the route for a long time. Markets stay nervous. Energy prices stay elevated. America feels pain, but mostly as a squeeze rather than a shock. In this scenario, gas stays uncomfortable, freight stays expensive, and inflation relief slows down. The second is the prolonged stress scenario. Shipping risk remains high. Insurance remains expensive. Alternative flows fail to fully compensate. Export competition intensifies. And energy prices stay high long enough to bleed into broader goods, services, and business behavior. That is where the story becomes less about one headline and more about a rolling cost of living problem. The third is the escalation scenario. Disruption worsens. Global supply tightens harder. Oil and fuel prices move sharply higher. And the U.S. economy gets hit by a more serious combination of inflation pressure, weakened confidence, and slower growth. That is the version policymakers fear most. Not because every shelf suddenly goes empty, but because the economy gets stuck in the worst kind of in-between state. Too much price pressure for comfort, too much uncertainty for confidence, and too little room for clean relief. So if Hormuz stays disrupted, America probably does not break all at once. It pays more. It delays relief. It absorbs more uncertainty. And it rediscovers an old truth of the global economy. Even when the shock begins far away, American households still end up meeting it at the pump, at checkout, and in the monthly budget. That is what is really at stake.
These charts show the reality. For ordinary Americans, the family home and our global standing are intrinsically linked.